Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to welcome you here with us on the Finance Day. As a finance specialist, I think this is one of the most important thematic days, but I'm biased, and forgive me for that. The problem of finance, or the ordeal of finance, does not only matter to developing countries. We're at times where all types of finance, whether green finance, blended finance, or all sides of finance, are crucial for all economies after the crisis, after the COVID crisis that we just went out from. Today's sessions are very interesting. The speakers come with a lot of information to share with you, a lot of interesting topics, so I encourage you to stay with us until our finance session that ends at 7 p.m. I will not take more time. I will pass the mic to Ms. Joanna Neiman, discussing the role of central banks in sustainable finance, discussing challenges and opportunities. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a great honor to welcome you to this session on the role of central banks in sustainable finance, challenges and opportunities. My name is Johanna Neumann. I'm the head of Inclusive Green Finance at the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. In this session, we will be discussing greening of the financial systems, and we have a very diverse, a very knowledgeable panel with us today that can tackle this subject from many different perspectives. We will start out by discussing the role of central banks in greening the financial system, following on by hearing from the MDB and the private sector perspective, and also to finish off discussing the different building blocks needed to establish successful frameworks and systems for greening financial systems at the national level. So, without further ado, let me introduce the panelists to you. We have Deputy Governor Mr. Rami Abulnaga, the Central Bank of Egypt, Managing Director Mr. Ravi Menon, Monetary Authority of Singapore, also Chair of the Link for Greening the Financial System, Mr. Emmanuel Merinkindi, Vice President for Cross-Cutting Solutions, IFC, Mr. Daniel Selikov, Vice Chair, Public Sector, JP Morgan, and Chair of the Governing Board of JP Morgan's Development Finance Institution, and Professor Dr. Dirk Zitze, other Chair in Financial Law, Inclusive Finance, University of Luxembourg. Please join me in welcoming all of these panelists. So to start off this conversation, I'm turning to you, Deputy Governor. Deputy Governor Abulnaga has been the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt since November 2019. He oversees the markets, foreign relations, monetary policy, economic research, information technology, and banking operations, as well as payment system sectors. But today he has joined us to discuss greening of the financial system. And I think it's very clear from the conversations we have here at COP and we've had in the last couple of years that in order to successfully green financial systems, there needs to be a very clear and strong collaboration between the public and private sectors. So therefore, central banks are needed to support the development of a more climate-considerate banking sector. So could you share from your perspective what can be done by both the regulators and the banks to strengthen climate finance?
Thank you very much, Joanna, for the introduction. I'm very delighted to be on this panel with this established group and amongst this established crowd. What can be done? A lot needs to be done. We have taken leaps, the world has taken leaps, but there's still a lot ahead of us that needs to be done. To start off, we need to raise a lot of awareness. I mean, the key word here, in my opinion, if I would summarize what needs to be done, is awareness. There has to be a drive that's stemming from not just the necessity, but the desire to drive that change. In many cases, it's a matter of necessity, but more importantly, to get this through, you need to have also an alignment on the desire that what needs to be done to achieve sustainable finance. Of course, the private and the public sector need to cooperate. There need to be harmonious policies between the private and the public sector with a clear understanding on the end game. Where do we want to go? What's the destination? How do we get there? I think this is a forum that needs to take place, and it's an ongoing dynamic process that will continue to happen, and there will be a lot of endeavors between the public and the private sector until we get there. And again, we will not just get there, it's an ongoing process, so it will require both parties to work very closely together in a tireless way to be able to set not just the objectives, but how to get there. You can have very nice and flashy titles, but to get there is another thing. Since this is a very nascent and novel field, you need to have a clear system and sphere where you will continue to mine the data, collect data, and have data symmetry. Information is key, and you want to make sure that with this evolving field, you have the right data that helps furnish your needs to be able to make proper assessments. To that effect, you need to build capacity. Again, this is a very nascent and novel field. To be able to build capacity, you will need resources and you need a lot of time. So both are critical, both are important. You have to work towards that so that you can reach a low carbon economy with a clear understanding of what needs to be done. So without having the right capacities both at the public sector and within the private realm, there's little that can be done. Building capacity is not a luxury, it's on both sides. Of course, with that comes the improvement of the knowledge that will be developed by both the private and public sector to be able to understand the real challenges that do stem from the climate risks. And to do that, with the capacity building, they will be able to identify what the risks are and to be able to raise the right awareness to the market. So this is something that, again, needs to be pushed for very forcefully by both the public and the private sector and all the other stakeholders. Central bank's role, now more specifically on our specific mandate. Again, we know that especially in developing markets, you cannot afford to have a bottoms-up approach because, again, you need to nudge the society, you need to nudge the stakeholders to be able to work towards that, towards these aligned goals. To do that, you have to really hold the torch and hold the fort well to be able to drive that change. So as a central bank, you can work on different fronts. Some of them I've mentioned already, but again, it has to be a top-down approach so that you can lead that kind of change. To give you more of an idea of what central banks can do, and again, there's no one specific global standard that the central banks have agreed to. Again, this is still a process in the making, so it will have different iterations, continuous developments, and thus every central bank has to adapt according to its own objectives, its own risks and challenges that do lie within its jurisdiction. To that effect, I think central banks need to start by nudging the society, nudging the different stakeholders as mentioned. To start off, they can roll out initiatives for adaptation and mitigation within the banking sector. These initiatives can be rolled out gradually as the capacity is being built across the banking sector. You do not want to have overly ambitious targets without having the right resources and the right skill set. Second to that is, of course, if you think of what needs to, what can really be done to have something that is material on the ground, you need to incentivize the different stakeholders. As a central bank, as a regulator, you can easily do that by looking at cost-related matters. So lowering the cost capital requirement is one of the easiest ways you can do that. It's basically setting clear cost requirements related to climate finance, which would help and encourage both banks and the borrowers to adapt and mitigate. By doing that, you really cut a lot of lines, and it makes it a lot more lucrative for the different stakeholders to have a clear incentive and advantage to be able to adopt and mitigate. Of course, you need to also have more governance and to regulate the environment in a way that doesn't make it havoc, where people are striving in with different efforts but there's not a clear guidance by the regulator. So issuing guidelines by the regulator is very necessary, and it's helpful. It anchors objectives and it aligns them, and it makes the process to sustainable finance and climate considerate financing a lot more easier to streamline across the ecosystem. Of course, as a central bank, you can lead by example as well. You can start by actually investing and deploying your own funds in climate considerate investments. So that's also another way where you can lead by example. And if you adopt a green finance or green bond framework, that will definitely also help boost and bolster matters in a more effective way. Closer to home, and what we have done as a central bank, at the Central Bank of Egypt, we have already worked on different fronts. As a matter of fact, we have already in 2021, July 2021, we have issued the guiding principle for sustainable finance. This set the general framework for sustainable finance, and it has helped again streamline all these thoughts that have been floating in the ecosystem around sustainable finance, on the right framework which needs to be adopted, and that has set general principles for the banks to follow going forward. We have also gone beyond that. We have issued initiatives. We have had 5 initiatives related to green finance. The first one was geared towards the MSME sector, to encourage them to use renewable energy in their operations in an effort to help lower their carbon emissions. We've also pushed different sectors to use natural gas. We've done that for bakeries. We've done that also in cars, where we've also initiated a dual fuel system. We've very consistent with the effort also encouraged through an initiative for modern irrigation systems as well. So these are just a few initiatives that the central bank has actually embarked on to help encourage and bolster green finance. Closer to, just earlier this month, we have also issued a sustainable finance regulation to the banks. This was more articulate and more focused, again, with the same intent to encourage banks, to help banks understand what the central bank's view and vision on that front is. And we've crafted that with the intention of not just getting that out, but to actually see more adoption by the banks to these to that framework. So it set the framework for sustainable finance, and it required banks to comply in 4 areas. The first one is to establish sustainable finance departments within the institution. The other one is to issue periodic reports on sustainability. Of course, by doing that, there's more awareness, there's more governance, and you create the right hype around that change, which again is a very ongoing process. We've also asked them to integrate the sustainable finance within banks' policies and procedures, so that it's well embedded and entrenched in the policies and procedures. And we've asked them to rely on environmental consultants to be able to assess environmental impacts, especially for the large projects with considerable carbon emissions. Last but not least, on the commercial banks front, we have also worked very closely with banks to ensure that they are very much in tandem with what we are trying to achieve as a central bank, as a regulator. And we have asked them to clearly follow certain guidelines that we have been set, such as adopting and adapting their internal credit risk models to capture climate physical risks in the credit risk assessment, as well as the quality of the collaterals. We have asked them to encourage them to generate and initiate new products that are climate considerate. So we are starting to hear more and more often now banks issuing products that are climate considerate and environment friendly, again, as an attempt and effort by the central bank to engage the banks and to indirectly raise awareness within their client base, because this is key, as we mentioned earlier. collecting data is also crucial so that we have the right database to be able to assess and forecast the needs and have a better understanding of what kind of risks they are exposed to. As mentioned, increasing client awareness is not a matter of luxury anymore. And last but not least, integrating their own policies within the national policy. Is Egypt, we have seen the Ministry of Environment said already issue their climate classification for carbon emissions. They have done that as a sort of a guiding principle to the market. We have the Egypt 2030 vision, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, all which are aiming towards sustainability, environmental considerations, very much in line with the country focus. So this is, in summary, the main thoughts that the central bank has followed. Of course, this is an ongoing process. I keep repeating, this is an ongoing process. Awareness is key. Onboarding and having a clear ownership of the stakeholders is also quite critical to make this materialize in a constructive way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Governor, for that rich overview. I think it's really impressive to see how the Central Bank of Egypt is leading in this space, having both a very strategic approach, but also investing in specific initiatives, working both on the broader macro level, but also targeting MSMEs and individuals with some of the initiatives, but also focusing not only on the mitigation side, but also on the adaptation and resilience building. So thank you so much for that overview, and looking forward also to seeing the next step for the central bank. We're going to continue with a focus on central banks and their role in sustainable finance. The Managing Director, Robbie Menon of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the Chair of the Network for Greening the Financial System. Mr. Menon is also a member of the Financial Stability Board Steering Committee. The NGFS was founded only 2017, very late in 2017, by 8 central banks, and at the moment you have 121 members by 19 observers. That's really a rapid growth, and I believe also the areas you've been focusing on have been developing quite rapidly in the last years. It's been fascinating to follow the development of the NGFS in the past years. And I'm now wondering if you could share a little bit more of the past journey of the NGFS, but also where you're heading right now and how you see the role of central banks in our strive for mitigation and resilience building.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. You've already given a very good introduction, and first off, thanks to the Central Bank of Egypt for putting this together, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be here. And just listening to the Deputy Governor, I think it's a model answer to what central banks and supervisors can do to green the financial system. So I'm going to speak primarily from the perspective of the Network for Greening the Financial System, and not so much from the Monetary Authority of Singapore. If there is time, we could come back to that. But I want to focus on what the network of central banks and financial supervisors for greening the financial system have been doing to answer the question that's before us: what's the role of central banks for greening the system? As we just reminded, NGFS was just formed in December 2017. We started off with 8 founding members. Today we have more than 140 members and observers. It's a remarkable growth, and basically it is a coalition of the willing to come together to help green the financial system. We can't do it alone, but we want to be as central banks and regulators to be as facilitative as possible. And today 140 central banks and supervisors and other international bodies share that vision and have been working together. Let me give a quick overview of what we're doing. I'll just list the initiatives and then go into details on just some of them in the interest of time. So what are the central banks doing for greening the financial system? 10 key initiatives that the NGFS is currently engaged in. First, We are enhancing supervisory practices for managing climate and environmental related risks. So these are risks that we need to watch, financial institutions are exposed to, and so how as a financial supervisor we can work with industry to manage those risks. That's one. Two, designing actionable climate scenarios. So much is unknown in this space. You want to work off scenarios, alternative scenarios for the future to do that risk assessment. Three, assessing the implications of climate change for monetary policy. We know it has an impact on macroeconomic outcomes, inflation, but what does it exactly mean for monetary policy responses? So that's another area we're studying and actually engaged in. Providing guidance for central banks' own net zero transitions. We need to set an example, and so what are central banks themselves able to do to get to net zero, both in the investment portfolio and their domestic operations and their production of notes and coins. Analyzing nature-related financial risks. That's number 5. So it's not just the climate. The loss of biodiversity and nature-related risks is an additional consideration for financial sector balance sheets. So that's another area we're looking at. 6, building the capacity among our members. 140 members at different stages of development, and we want to gear up everyone as quickly as possible to a high level of competence in dealing with environmental and climate-related risks in the financial system. And then next, raising awareness about growing legal and litigation risks. So this is work in its infancy, but this is also something we need to watch out both for the financial sector and for the central banks. 9, we are advancing our collective knowledge on climate-related issues through research on emerging topics. And finally, we are acting as a convener and facilitator to bring key stakeholders together to accelerate and scale up blended finance, which involves fundamentally public-private partnerships. And we see ourselves as central banks and supervisors as public sector organizations having that role. So this is just a list of the 10. I'm going to touch on just a few of them in the interest of time. First, supervisory practices. One of the things that we are looking at is the role of central banks and financial supervisors in engaging financial institutions on their transition plans. Transition plans are absolutely critical for us to get to net zero. And financial institutions have made strong commitments to do that. But what is the plan to get there? What is their plan with respect to individual sectors? So they need to understand sectoral pathways, they need to engage they need to have engagement with these borrowers on how they're going to do their transition. So that's an area that is very new to central banks and supervisors. So we're looking into how we engage them on transition plans and how we can use that to green the financial system. Second, the NGFS climate scenarios. This is our flagship product. More than 30 central banks and supervisors have used the NGFS climate scenarios, which broadly consists of six scenarios in 3 categories. An orderly transition to net zero, you get to about 1.5 degrees. A disorderly transition, which is delayed and therefore disorderly. And a hothouse world. We don't do enough, climate change takes place, how do we deal with that scenario? So we have distinct scenarios that we've worked out, and we just released our 3rd vintage of those scenarios, and we're gratified that so many central banks are using them for their stress tests. You use these scenarios to subject financial institutions' balance sheets to these tests, look at the outcomes and make assessments of the kinds of risks and how those risks can be mitigated. The IMF is using these scenarios, the NGFS scenarios, for its own financial sector assessment program. It cannot be more timely, if I may say so. The latest version makes important adjustments to how to measure the impact of physical risk. And we've already seen this past year, the heat waves and droughts in Europe, North America, China, the floods in Pakistan, Australia, and so on. Physical change is already happening, and it's so timely to actually have those physical impacts and their risk implications measured and analyzed. So that's a very good thing that we've done, and we need to further improve on that in the next iteration of the scenarios. The other thing that the scenarios did is to look at the implications of higher energy prices. And it could not have been more timely, because right now the world is facing an acute energy crisis globally. High energy prices stemming from the war in Ukraine, and it's still feeding through into all our economies in the form of higher inflation. This is made, and we put out an additional companion report to say that this is, while deeply challenging from an inflation perspective, it provides a powerful incentive. Basically, we've gotten a high carbon price. What is necessary to make renewable energy more financially viable? And there's an additional element of energy security. So I think this is a good opportunity, and the NGFS has put out its arguments for why it is important to accelerate the clean energy transition, because if we don't, we're going to get the kind of effects we're having right now multiplied in the future in a disorderly transition to net zero. We'll continue to refine the scenarios, and this is ongoing work at the NGFS. Very quickly on biodiversity. The loss of biodiversity has got implications for the climate, but also has independent implications on food supply, water supply, the quality of the air, and a whole range of human activities. We are beginning to see some of these effects of nature-related risks manifesting. And this is something financial institutions need to pay close attention to. So there's work that the NGFS is doing on how we can make sense of this. And this is a lot more complex, because unlike climate, you can measure greenhouse gas emissions and their impact. A molecule of CO2 is the same everywhere in the world. But nature-related risks tend to be very localized. So we need metrics to deal with these risks and what we can do to mitigate these risks through the financial system. Next, I'll just touch on briefly on blended finance and finish off. We need public and private capital partnership to bring on board the capital and financing necessary for the green transition. And this is a lot of work. We need to improve the risk-return profile for many marginally bankable projects. In many emerging economies, the green and transition projects are marginally bankable. We just need a little bit more effort in risk mitigation in order to get them over the hurdle and draw in private capital. This is critically important, and by absorbing a portion of the project risk, providing key technical assistance, and lending their reputation and expertise, the public sector, which includes national governments and multilateral development banks, can help to attract private investors. We need to do this. There is no shortage of private capital, but private capital will not come into many of these projects until the risk-return profile is better sorted out. And so there's great opportunity here for public-private partnerships to scale up blended finance. And so today, later this just a few hours, we will be announcing well, I'm already announcing it now, the NGFS's launch of the Blended Finance Initiative. Now, we are not going to be the ones lending money, of course, but central banks and supervisors, we're trying to bring together a coalition of multilateral development banks, governments, financial institutions with whom we have close relationships and partnerships to see how we can work this, and also to draw in philanthropic capital. So all hands on deck. That's what we need to solve the transition. And a key deliverable for this is a handbook that we're going to produce, which will lay out the test cases from previous instances and what are some of the lessons going forward. So those are, very briefly, I've listed the 10 initiatives and highlighted about 3 or 4. And so I hope that answers the question of whether there is a role for central banks. There's a huge role for central banks and financial supervisors in the fight against climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much also for that very clear answer at the end, and for sharing some of the really impressive initiatives by the NGFS. I think the last point you made, Managing Director, on the blended finance and marginally bankable projects is so important to take on board, especially also when we look at MSMEs in developing and emerging economies, and that is also an area where I believe a lot more focus should be going in the coming years. But also a perfect segue to our next speaker and panelists, Emmanuel Nurinkindi, IFC's Vice President of Cross-Cutting Solutions. He is responsible for overseeing cross-cutting services globally, including public-private partnerships and corporate finance, global upstream projects and programs to proactively create new investable opportunities in markets, sustainability and gender solutions, as well as climate. So I think that perfectly fits on to where the previous speaker ended. So Vice President Nurinkindi, from the IFC's perspective, can you share more about the developments in the past years, especially how MDBs or international institutions can do to advance national level policy development, and how you see the response to green finance regulation and policy development amongst?
We can add value in sharing best practices, we can add value in convening, but also very importantly in investing activity. So I think the Deputy Governor pointed out the importance, and also Mr. Menon, of public-private partnerships. Let me share a couple of ways that I think we can be extremely helpful in this. So the World Bank, as one of the core MDBs, has done a financial sector assessment program which addresses climate risk assessments and has worked with central banks in the Philippines, in Bangladesh and in Morocco, so working with the public sector. On the MDB front, they have created several financing platforms, particularly for developing countries where the challenge is particularly acute within emerging markets. And here we have instruments such as the Clean Technology Fund, the scaling up of renewable programs, and also the Green Climate Fund. So all these instrumental in bringing financing to the cause of green financing in the emerging markets. If I focus on the IFC, which is a leading DFI, particularly for emerging markets, what have we done? And speak to those 4 points of innovation. Let me start with our investing activity. So we are quite involved as investors in looking at various ways to mobilize other investors through the setting up of funds and platforms that channel climate financing to emerging markets. And here we have platforms that we set up with Amundi, Allianz, and others that have been mentioned on the table, where we channel sustainable financing to sustainable projects, which is sorely needed in emerging markets. Last year at COP we announced two key platforms, the MCPP One Planet and the Seed Bond program. In this region, we made our first green bond investment in Morocco and Banque Centrale Populaire in June 2017, just to speak to the example of the region. And in South Africa, we supported the Standard Chartered Bank in March of 2020 with its first offshore green bond issuance, which was also, coincidentally, Africa's largest green bond. We then also supported a first round in South Africa to grow its climate portfolio, particularly in renewable energy, and that has dedicated funding for water smart projects. First time that's done in this part of the world and this country. So key water security, which is a key feature for adaptation. Closer to home in Egypt, we were very pleased and honored to support the Commercial International Bank by being an investor in its green bond, which has been key in opening up spaces with renewable energy, green buildings and energy efficiency. And we have also been able to support CIB with capacity building and in the effective utilization of these proceeds. So our role as an investor and in bringing innovation through investing activity. We think, to your second question about supporting the development of national plans, again, there is quite a lot of capacity in countries, so we are supplemental to the efforts. But the importance of bringing new knowledge, bringing new tools, but supporting also technology transfer, this is important for developing strategy and also for supporting national action plans. We are, as I said, a convener, and I want to talk to our role with the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, which were instrumental in forming and have the pleasure of being their secretariat since 2012. The SBFN, to just use the acronym, includes about 74 institutions which are representing 62 countries, but also represent 43 trillion in assets and represent about 86% of the balance sheet of the emerging markets. This is a huge competing power that we are proud to be a part of, and we're very honored to have the Central Bank of Egypt and also the Federation of Egyptian Bankers. And very much we're able to help in their efforts to develop the guiding principles for sustainable finance in 2021. So that was a very deep honor, Deputy Governor, to join you. What we think in terms of your third question of how do we support the greening of the financial sector, I think the critical role that has been mentioned by both the Deputy Governor and Mr. Menon of regulation and the central bank leading in that particular front, this is key. So just to say two more things on that, we think it's important to support through the global and regional reach and expertise that we have as an institution, but working in consonant with other DFIs. And here, I think the importance is of leveraging data, some of the point that the Governor mentioned, in setting of global standards and sharing global best practices, but also very important in advancing common taxonomies and establishing global standards. The last thing I wanted to say on that is that as we develop projects, I think it's very important that we are able to measure the impact of the projects that we are financing to make the case for continuing to invest in green, but also the importance of reporting, and particularly reporting of climate risks. This is something that as a DFI is able to support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what we're getting back to time after another is the importance of building the capacity, establishing the frameworks for the data, having the common standards in place, and ensuring that we report the risks adequately. So thank you so much to share these perspectives from IFC as well. Continuing with our fourth panelist, Mr. Daniel Selikov is the Vice Chair, Public Sector at JP Morgan and Chair of the Governing Board of JP Morgan's Development Finance Institution. He leads a team that manages the bank's business with public sector clients such as central banks, sovereign wealth funds, public pensions, governments and their agencies and international institutions. Prior to joining JP Morgan, Mr. Selikov was the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Inter-American Development Bank, and as well as before that held key positions in the US Treasury. So from the perspective of a large bank in the private sector, how do you at JP Morgan think we can best catalyze private sector capital flows to support climate-friendly development in emerging markets? Please.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Joanna. I'm glad you asked the question that way. But before I get started, I do want to thank the Egyptian authorities for laying on really a fantastic event in such great hosts and creating a venue where not only important negotiations can occur, but one where there's tremendous energy for those not involved in the negotiations to discuss the best ideas we have about how to deal with one of the most important existential issues of our time. So, as to your question, I think the way I want to respond to it is by making a few points about kind of how we see the lay of the land. The first and most important is that we perceive there to be more of a project gap. That is, assets in which investors can invest than there is a financing gap. We believe that there's plenty of private finance out there. There's a lot of public financing out there too, but the quantum of private finance vastly exceeds that which is available to public sector lenders or investors. And we should bear that in mind when we're designing policy. Now, what does that mean for countries that hope to green their own societies? The first and most important, and it's not new, is putting in place strong macroeconomic policies and sectorial policies that will make those sectors investable. And you know, this can take decades of lots of hard work, but it is doable. And one has seen over the past few decades, literally hundreds of millions of people now live in countries where the financing cost has dropped very, very dramatically. Now, when we're talking about an issue like climate change, we don't have decades to wait. So I think that's where it becomes very important for the public sector, as Ravi Menon had spoken of, to combine its resources in ways that make a project financeable. But that's not the only way that I think that multilateral institutions, DFIs, and other aid agencies can work to improve the situation. They should continue to do the work that they've always done in supporting macroeconomic and microeconomic policies to work side by side with those governments that are seeking to make themselves more investable. But I would also say that there may be kind of more, and this is not to suggest that that public agencies should diminish the financial resources that are available in their day-to-day work. But what I do think would be very much valued is to devote some more of those resources to make a relative shift towards project development work. And that means working with the national authorities to identify projects that will make a difference in green finance, prioritizing them, helping design concessions so that the risks are borne in the right pockets, whether by an official institution, the government, lenders, or project sponsors. It's very difficult, but at the end of the day, a wind farm in Germany costs about the same to finance as a wind farm in Mauritania, but for perceived country risk. So the more that we can do to diminish that country risk in the short term and to overcome it with official financing, should the short term be too short, the better. I think that the other thing that would be very, very helpful is for the projects that are developed, the project development work that official institutions should do, the linkage should be severed from project financing activity. That means that the first call on financing a project should be left to the private sector. And only if the private sector is unprepared or unwilling to finance a project should the public sector set in. And I think this is really, you know, an approach that's been adopted by the IFC and some others as well, where it's increasingly reliant on the private sector to take the lead, but very important for the project development work that the official sector does to continue and to be scaled up dramatically. And if one were to look at the numbers of staff in all of the official institutions that are devoted to project development work as opposed to project finance, I think you'd find that the proportions don't actually reflect what I'm saying. And finally, so what should private firms be doing, like ourselves? Now, of course, we're doing our own work as an institution to green ourselves, to green our lending activities. That's not what we're going to talk about right now. But what I do want to mention is an initiative that we launched in January of 2020 with the important assistance of the IFC and other development institutions, where what we're doing is we're borrowing their knowledge rather than their money. We adopted what they call the Anticipated Impact Measurement System. I don't know if I've got that right, but it's something like that, to our much broader range of products and services that we have available at JP Morgan, to launch what we're calling the JP Morgan DFI. Now, what's the point of the DFI? It's really quite a simple idea, but we hope to be very powerful. That is, namely, it's to standardize what we mean by green finance, but in particular, in general, development finance. To standardize our discussion about anticipated impacts, to come up with acceptable metrics, to come up with monitoring and evaluation frameworks that the users of capital will abide by, and then to do our best to socialize these standards across the financial ecosystem. And that's really what we're doing just now, is we are convening groups of multilaterals, peer institutions such as ourselves. We're hoping a couple of central banks will be joining us, as well as some key institutional investors, to agree on what these standards ought to look like. And once we have them, we think that it'll be much more viable to mobilize the more than $100 trillion in investable capital that's out there. In short, and just to summarize, we think there's more of a project gap than a financing gap. We think that there's no substitute for the ongoing work on strong policies, both at the macro and the micro level. The multilaterals and the development institutions are enormously useful in supporting that reform effort. They're also critical for providing financing when the private sector won't come in, because that work has yet to kind of be done effectively. But then, from our perspective, most importantly, coming up with products that we think will be invested in by private investors, which could really make a big difference in terms of greening the financial system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Selikov. It's not the financing gap, but the project gap. I think that's a very interesting conclusion to share, and also sets a clear challenge ahead of all of us to green the financial systems. This brings us to our fifth speaker today, Professor Dr. Zece, professor in financial law at the University of Luxembourg, where he holds the ADA chair in financial law, inclusive finance since March 2016. Dr. Zece, you've been researching extensively about sustainable and green finance in the past years. So could you please share some of your insights on the prerequisites to develop domestic green finance? And also, what are the current trends that you're observing right now?
Thank you very much, Johanna. Also for the introduction, and thank you very much also to the Central Bank of Egypt for organizing this wonderful venue here. When we think about robust frameworks for inclusive green finance, sustainable finance in general, then we should think about 6 building blocks. 6 building blocks in the sense that these are preconditions for effective policies that result in the projects that we need. The first is, of course, a strategy. The strategy is easy to write, hard to enforce. So in that regard, paper is patient, and we all need to be aware that we write on paper needs good measurements afterwards. So when you write a strategy, already think about how can you measure progress, because when you can't measure, you can't implement, you can't convince people that what you have done was really effective. The second aspect is a classification system. And when we think about classification systems, we have a broad array of choices. We can start with very granular taxonomies like the Europeans did, then we will probably achieve nothing. Why not? Because it takes a lot of regulatory capacity. Instead, you can start with your national priorities. When you have a water problem, too much or too little water, then this is your problem. And this is where you should start. You shouldn't try to solve the whole world's problem with one piece of legislation. That's just impossible. So start where the problems are, focus on them, and mitigate these problems with an effective classification system, and leave the rest for broad principles. So here it is really, really crucial that if you want too much, you won't achieve anything. And this is always to be kept in mind for effective regulatory policies. A third element is prioritization. Prioritization means inside the central bank, and for instance, having a sustainability department is a strong indicator of prioritization, but also prioritization among the financial institutions that are active in your jurisdiction. And here, policies like sustainable banking principles or an ESRM guideline or something like that have the effect of prioritization. So it's not that these guidelines are so 100% perfect or effective. It is that they ask to change the tone at the top, that really these things matter. Because when you have these policies in place, you can't disregard these values in the policies when you have to report on these policies. So that changes the tone of the top inside the institutions. Number 4, and this is, I think, I heard it in every panel since I arrived here on Monday morning, this is data and models. Data and models. Very few data exist that are really granular and sufficiently disaggregated to be used for our purposes. We have mesh data, we have usually a lot of rough estimates in the market. Again, we can't change the data gap overnight. That will take too many scientists that we don't have right now. But we can focus on our national priorities, develop data sets that we can measure, and be granular in your approaches. Don't mesh something together that doesn't fit. In this regard, work together with the quantitative finance people, because they usually know how to disaggregate data. Yeah? So it's really crucial that we get away from this excuse, we don't have data, we can't measure. If we do this, we will never be able to convince the donors, but also the private financiers that what we do makes any change. I think something that has been underestimated is the role of an ecosystem. A sound sustainable finance approach is not an approach by one bank. A sound sustainable finance approach requires thousands of different experts, from scientists to lawyers to auditors to data generators to model testers to finance people trying to find a correlation between these data that they have and the financial output. Because something shall not be underestimated. There is a huge lack of evidence between the financial output, that there's a link between the financial output and the sustainability impact so far. That is a very, very weak point in the whole argument that we have, and we can only remedy that problem when we collect granular data and focus on this model development together with a strong ecosystem. And this ecosystem is not necessarily a department inside a bank. It may be a free agent, it may be a fintech firm, it may be someone who comes from the university with a great exercise in quantitative finance and now applies these same skills to sustainability data. Yeah? So here it's crucial to understand that sustainable finance is not the job of the central bank, of the economy as such. And my 6th point is the role of financial infrastructure. Sustainable finance requires finance, and that requires access to finance. I think I cannot stress that point too much, that financial inclusion is a precondition for finance-based transformation of the economy. When you don't have access to finance, let's forget the financial system as a transforming entity. Yeah? And this is of course not a problem in, let's say, in Luxembourg, where I come from, where we have probably more banks than people. But of course the problem is, of course, there. In many countries of the world, we have just 4 banks and they serve usually the citizens in the capital. That doesn't really help us. So we need to have an inclusive finance approach if we want to achieve something. Why inclusive finance? Because inclusive finance is our key to long-termism. When I don't have means to store value, I will overconsume today. Because otherwise the mice or the husband will take the money. Yeah? And it's better to consume it than to give it to someone else. Yeah? And in this regard, money storage mechanisms, money transfer mechanisms are a precondition for long-termism, long-term action, where basically the investment period and the financing period and the usage period are in line. And this is what we need. To implement that, of course, we have to keep 3 things in mind. First, there is no blueprint. No one on this planet knows what is the best approach to your country. Only yourself knows where the problems are, and these type of national priorities must be set and implemented with a certain robustness. What does that mean? There shall not be an election or a power change that changes the impact of these policies. When you have short-term policies for long-term goals, it doesn't fly. So you need to ensure a long-term governance scheme and rely on the most solid institutions inside your society that can vouch for a 5-year, 15-year investment horizon, because this is how investors think. Yeah? This is the robust framework you ask for. You don't necessarily ask for a lot of things, but you ask that the promises given today hold true in 10 years from now, because this is the investment horizon of the investors that want to make a change. Second aspect, please to consider, when we speak about change, we usually think about the multinationals, but the multinationals are usually impacted by global standard setters. What you can change is, of course, the role of the micro, small and medium enterprises which have a local reach. This is where the true impact of your policies will be. And here it's important to understand that we shouldn't look at them as individuals, but more as sectors or as bulk. We do the same in the Basel Capital Standards, that we also treat small clients as one group together. And this is exactly what we need to do in terms of sustainability impact. And why is that? If we ask the small entities to give us data, their financing costs are higher than the benefits of finance. Quite simple, because the data generation cost will exceed the benefits of finance. Quite simple. Yeah? So all what we do must be cost efficient. And here, making good bulks, good aggregated data sets out of granular data that we collect somewhere else, not from these small entities, will probably be the key to finding a good proportionality between a granular steering effect and at the same time keeping the cost of finance at bay. Finally, whatever you regulate requires a view not on a risk, but also on double materiality. Risk is only one dimension of that. When we focus excessively on risk, we will exclude many small and medium enterprises because they're just risky. They rely on usually one or two people in the firm. That is a huge operational risk. So a risk-based focus will lead to exclusionary effect, which we don't like. So rather than that, we need to focus on the public effects, on the public good. And there are no defenders of the public good if it's not the central bank, the financial regulator, and the politics. So in this regard, a purely risk-based approach can't be the answer to our sustainability issues that we have. It must be a kind of approach that looks as a balance of the risk perspective and the sustainability perspective, i.e. the public good. And with that again, back to you. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think sharing those 6 building blocks is a splendid way of concluding this panel and really bringing together the different prerequisites needed in order to green financial systems at the national level. This panel today has been taking us through the role of central banks, but not only central banks, but the different stakeholders of the ecosystems to green financial sectors. I feel a lot of pride because a couple of years ago we would have been discussing if there is a role of central banks. Today we're not even having that debate, we're actually discussing how. And we're also sharing concrete practices and examples of what's being done today. And not only is this a conversation between central bankers at the spring meetings, but it's involving different stakeholders into the conversation. And we are today, not in DC, but we are at COP27, bringing this conversation to even broader audiences and ensuring that central banks and different financial institutions at the national and international levels are a part of this crucial conversation. So with that, a really big thank you to the Central Bank of Egypt for hosting this panel today, and a big thank you to all the panelists.